Vietnam experienced decades of war, beginning with the communists fighting against French colonial rule in the 1940s, and ending when they captured Saigon and took control of the entire country in 1975, a period Americans refer to as the Vietnam War, and Vietnamese call the Resistance War against America. This period marked the U.S. military intervention from 1965 to 1973. Communist forces in the North, led by nationalist leader Ho Chi Minh, defeated the French in 1954. The Geneva Accords were signed, dividing Vietnam into a communist North and a U.S.-aligned South, separated by a demilitarized zone at the 17th parallel. There was a promise of nationwide elections to determine a long-term solution, but that never happened. Within 5 years, communist forces launched a guerrilla war in the South. Hundreds of thousands of American troops were sent to Vietnam to help fight the communist forces in a costly and ultimately unsuccessful war that caused domestic turmoil in the U.S. and embarrassment on the international stage. The U.S. was driven by Cold War fears of communist expansion, particularly the domino theory, the idea that if one Asian nation fell to leftist ideology, others would quickly follow. The Vietnam War was long and bloody. The Hanoi government estimated that over 21 years of fighting, 4 million civilians died across North and South Vietnam, and 1.1 million communist fighters were killed. U.S. records show that between 200,000 and 250,000 South Vietnamese soldiers died, along with 58,200 American troops killed or missing in action. Preparation for War, 1960 to 1964. By the late 1950s, a communist guerrilla force commonly known as the Viet Cong emerged in the South, supported and supplied from Hanoi via a network known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This force grew as discontented Southerners joined, frustrated by the corrupt government and repression under self-declared President Ngo Dinh Diem. The U.S. had been supplying aid, military equipment, and training to the South Vietnamese government since 1954. As the Viet Cong expanded, U.S. support increased with helicopters, armored troop carriers, and thousands of American military advisors. By 1963, however, the Diem regime had become so unpopular that the U.S. did nothing to prevent a coup by dissident generals. What followed was a series of short-lived and unstable governments, none of which could effectively counter the insurgency. A major catalyst for deeper U.S. involvement came in August 1964, when North Vietnamese torpedo boats fired on a U.S. destroyer in the Gulf of Tonkin. President Lyndon Johnson used a second alleged attack, later disputed, as justification to launch bombing raids on North Vietnamese naval bases. By the end of 1964, there were 23,000 U.S. military advisors in Vietnam, up from just 800 in the 1950s. Meanwhile, Viet Cong forces had begun directly attacking American personnel and bases. Escalation of the war, 1965 to 1967. In February 1965, as South Vietnam's army made little headway against the Viet Cong, the U.S. launched Operation Rolling Thunder, a sustained bombing campaign against targets in North Vietnam. But it quickly became apparent that U.S. air power alone could not stop Viet Cong activity in the South. In July 1965, the U.S. announced the deployment of 100,000 troops to Vietnam. Allied countries such as Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, the Philippines, and Thailand also sent troops. The American strategy was one of escalation and attrition, aiming to destroy the communist forces' capacity to fight rather than seize territory. The next 2 years saw major battles near Da Nang, in Tuy Hoa, and Nha Trang in the Central Highlands, along with large-scale U.S. operations targeting communist bases. Despite heavy losses, communist forces continued fighting and often retook areas after U.S. forces withdrew. Viet Cong guerrillas were hard to distinguish from civilians and moved efficiently through difficult terrain. American aircraft sprayed millions of liters of toxic herbicides, most notoriously Agent Orange, on dense jungle foliage used by Viet Cong fighters for cover. The U.S. also conducted intense bombing campaigns, including the use of napalm. The Communists countered with anti-aircraft defenses and jet fighters supplied by allies like the Soviet Union and China. By the end of 1967, there were 485,000 American troops in Vietnam. The growing U.S. casualties and the toll on Vietnamese civilians triggered widespread protests back in the United States, and the outcome of the war remained uncertain. Turning point, 1968. On January 31, 1968, North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces launched a massive offensive during the Lunar New Year, Tet, holiday. In a series of simultaneous and surprise attacks, Communist forces struck 36 provincial capitals and 5 of the 6 major cities, including Saigon, where they breached the grounds of the U.S. Embassy. 10 days earlier, they had begun an assault on a U.S. Marine base near the demilitarized zone, successfully diverting American attention away from their true objectives. Although caught off guard, U.S. and South Vietnamese troops managed to repel the offensive relatively effectively. Communist forces were unable to hold any location for more than a few days, except for the city of Hue, which they controlled for 3 weeks. The Viet Cong suffered heavy losses, but the attack dealt a serious blow to American public opinion. Graphic footage of the brutal fighting raised concerns about mounting casualties, and the fact that the Viet Cong could launch such a bold attack undermined White House claims of progress. Political support for President Lyndon Johnson eroded. In March 1968, he halted the bombing campaign, called for peace talks, and announced he would not seek re-election in the November 1968 presidential race. However, fierce fighting continued on the battlefield, as both sides tried to capitalize on what they each believed to be strategic advantages. U.S. withdrawal, 1969 to 1973. President Richard Nixon, elected in November 1968, sought a withdrawal strategy that would allow the U.S. to exit with dignity. In June 1969, he announced a policy of Vietnamization, training and equipping the South Vietnamese Army so that U.S. forces could be reduced. Over the next year, more than 500,000 American troops were withdrawn from Vietnam. This worsened already low morale among soldiers, leading to widespread desertion and drug abuse. Public hostility in the U.S. persisted, fueled by a series of events. 2 U.S. offensives targeting communist bases and supply routes in Cambodia in 1970 and 1972 sparked protests. The Battle of Hamburger Hill in June 1969 raised new concerns about wasted American lives, as 46 U.S. soldiers died in a bloody but ultimately meaningless battle. The hill was abandoned shortly after. The My Lai massacre, in which over 300 civilians were slaughtered by U.S. troops in a village in Son Tin District, Quang Ngai Province, in 1968, came to light, further shocking the public. After the death of President Ho Chi Minh in 1969, General Secretary Le Duan continued the war effort. In 1972, Communist forces launched another major offensive, which was repelled by overwhelming U.S. air power. Starting in 1969, slow and complicated peace negotiations were held in Paris. These were interrupted by a massive 8-day U.S. bombing campaign over Hanoi. By 1972, final negotiations led to a peace agreement in January 1973. According to the Paris Peace Accords, U.S. troops would withdraw, and South Vietnam would have the right to determine its own future. The fall of Saigon, 1975. The last U.S. soldiers left Vietnam in March 1973, but what some described as a proxy war continued. Both North and South Vietnam accused each other of violating the ceasefire terms, and fighting resumed, though with less intensity and fewer casualties than previous years. U.S. aid to South Vietnam gradually declined, and the South Vietnamese government grew weaker. In early March 1975, following a successful campaign earlier that year, Hanoi launched the first phase of a final offensive to take over the country. The South Vietnamese defense collapsed more quickly than expected. Within 7 weeks, Communist forces swept through the Central Highlands and coastal regions. Millions of refugees fled toward Saigon. On April 21st, as North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces closed in on Saigon, South Vietnamese President Nguyen Van Thieu resigned and fled to Taiwan, bitterly accusing the U.S. of betrayal. 6 days later, the city was surrounded. Communist troops began shelling various districts, including civilian areas. Looting broke out. On April 29th, the U.S. ordered a helicopter evacuation of 7,000 American personnel and South Vietnamese officials from the city. Refugees scrambled to escape. The following day, on April 30th, 1975, communist tanks rolled into downtown Saigon without resistance. The city was soon renamed Ho Chi Minh City. Ho Chi Minh City. After the victory of the People's Army of Vietnam, hundreds of thousands of South Vietnamese fled by boat, fearing retribution. They became part of the first wave of Vietnamese boat people.